Hello, and welcome to the Sedgwick Podcast, where we explore innovation shaping the future of claims administration and risk management. My name is Kimberly George, and I have the honor of serving as Sedgwick's Global Chief Brand Officer and host for today's conversation. Please be sure and hit the like button, as that shares the podcast more broadly, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Sedgwick conducted a global risk study in late 2025 to better understand forces shaping our industry. Respondents to the survey were Fortune 500 executives, and the report was influenced by Sedgwick's own clients and leaders. I encourage you to check out the report at sedgwick.com. We're going to be talking today about risk management, and according to our recent study, only 3% of organizations consider themselves fully prepared for major global risks, while 91% rate their readiness as mostly or moderately prepared. Meanwhile, 59% report that their global risk exposure increased compared to the previous year. My guest today knows all about risk exposure, Dave Arick. Welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Hey, Kimberly, thank you for having me.
Why don't you introduce yourself, share a little bit about your role and your background?
Sure. So I joined Sedgwick almost 2 years ago, and my role currently is overseeing risk management, which at Sedgwick encompasses insurable risk, business continuity, health and safety, physical security, and also drone operations as of last fall. So it's a pretty broad mandate within the company. And that was part of what drew me to the role. I've been in risk management, broadly speaking, for almost 35 years. I kind of lose track after a while, but I've worked in a couple of different industries over the years, and most of the time in some kind of a global role. I really enjoy the space, and I'm glad to be at Sedgwick and talking to you today.
Wonderful. Well, let's get started. The global risk landscape, we just mentioned, or I mentioned in the opening around the study, and there's rising exposure. And let's start there. So the survey shows that geopolitical instability is a priority for 56% of our respondents, cyber threats 50%, and AI risks 45%. So these are top concerns of executives, yet most organizations admit they're only moderately prepared. Why do you think there's such a gap between the rising risk and the actual preparedness?
Well, I think there were probably a couple of things here. One, geopolitics and the uncertainty around the news cycle these days is really hard to plan around. I think that's probably an area where if you're looking solely at that space, companies would say that they're just not prepared. And by the time you can possibly prepare for one action, it's changed or evolved or turned into something different. So I think that's a really difficult thing for companies to prepare for. I think cybersecurity is one that people have their arms around. It's taking companies a number of years to get mature in that space, but when you look at what's happening today with CISOs and specialized vendors and disaster recovery preparedness, companies, I think, probably believe they're better prepared in that space than maybe some others. But I'd say one thing that probably factors into the survey responses here is, I believe at least, that a lot of executives are overly optimistic of their internal capabilities and how ready they are for different scenarios to occur. So I think if you were to ask the C-suite this question versus asking the risk community, the gap is probably smaller when you ask the execs than when you ask risk managers, meaning risk managers probably say, we're probably not as prepared as we think we are. And I think that's just a difference of perspective. The risk managers a lot of times aren't at the table when those conversations are happening around strategy and dealing with kind of macro level risks. It's usually a board level in C-suite conversation, and risk managers, I think, increasingly are getting a seat, or at least are informing executives around those conversations, but probably not as often as we would hope for as risk professionals.
Yeah, and the unpredictability of some of these risks going on. Do you think that plays a part as well?
Yeah, I think if you could measure uncertainty in the stock market, you've got the VIX and you've got indices that measure volatility and uncertainty. In the outside world, outside of investments, it's a lot more difficult to measure what that looks like. But anecdotally, I think we all would argue that uncertainty is increasing, volatility is increasing, and that's probably increasing faster in those two areas than the
Mhm.
investment in preparation and resilience. That's a big concern. And I think that's one that risk managers and risk professionals more broadly need to get their arms around.
Yeah, that uncertainty, never comfortable at the C-suite level that were our respondents in the study, but the reality of what a risk manager faces every day, I anticipate.
Absolutely.
Let's move on to a reactive to a proactive response. Given that 59% of organizations say that their risk exposures increase, but only a handful feel prepared. And again, we just talked about that response may change depending on the chair with which you sit or the role you have in your organization. But can you share some ways that risk managers plan and engage with their internal partners?
Well, I think there are a couple of different ways, and depending on what your scope of responsibility is internally. So I mentioned, business continuity is an area that I'm involved in, and so those conversations give us a lot of insight about how operations think about things that could impact their ability to serve clients and help fulfill the corporate mission. So that's one area that I think is an obvious one for risk professionals. If you're involved in business continuity or disaster recovery on the IT side, to try to be more involved than what you are today. And if you're not involved currently, then those are things that you really could get a greater awareness inside the company or, encourage investment if it's not being done. And so I think that's one thing, is just looking at what's working today and how can risk managers be more involved. And other is looking at scenario planning. And, I don't think risk managers need to be at the head of the table in talking about scenario planning, but as far as a strategic planning tool, I think wherever those strategy conversations are happening, whether at the business unit level or at the corporate board level, scenario planning is a really good tool for helping a firm think through what uncertainties can impact their plans from playing out the way they want. So upside and downside scenarios. So it's very similar to what I think we're all comfortable with in BCP or IT tabletop exercises, where you walk through an exercise and you think about what your existing plans are and what your existing capabilities are, where the biggest gaps lie relative to different scenarios, and how those kind of optimistic to pessimistic or even status quo scenarios play out, and how prepared you are for dealing with those outcomes where you don't have good plans, good preparations, good investment, how you can improve capabilities. So going forward, then, as those scenarios play out, you have an idea of what the signs are for, say, the optimistic scenario to play out. And you can think about how you need to adapt your strategy and your planning to that scenario versus maybe a more pessimistic one would require a different kind of investment and planning.
What about cyber? Do we do that for cyber, or are there practical interventions that either we're deploying or others?
Or I think cyber is an area where that space has evolved quite a bit in the last, 10 to 15 years. So if you think back, Y2K, for example, cyber was this thing that none of us really understood. It's like, wow, computer systems can make companies fail or not be able to operate. So it went, at least in my anecdotal view, it went from that kind of scenario to bad guys trying to exploit vulnerabilities, and small groups of IT professionals trying to figure out how to prevent those things from disrupting their business. And now it's evolved into very specialized areas where you've got IT security professionals that are dedicated to fighting this fight. You've got specialized vendors and tools and resources, and companies figure out that they really need to invest on an ongoing basis to stay ahead of the threat actors. And one valuable tool that's evolved along those lines is an outcropping from business continuity. And that's really, doing disaster recovery plans and then doing tabletop tests. So I think most companies do, at least annual, if not more often, tabletop tests of what could go wrong with their systems. How does it affect us doing business? What are our workarounds? What are our recovery times? What are backup systems? How do we test those backup systems? And so I think that's a really good example of something that's evolved into almost table stakes these days for any company. And how do you take that same kind of approach and apply it in other areas that aren't related to your technology stacks?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, where other parts of the business may not have participated in these in the past, but you've got a opportunity to take the learnings from cyber and bring it elsewhere, and the teams know that it have been taking place in the organization. So I'm sure it helps with the buy-in and understanding of why we need to do that in other parts of the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe another piece to that is to the extent you can quantify your risk and what your investment looks like, you can start having a real strategic conversation around how do you deploy capital around the biggest risks, the biggest potential disruptors to your business. And I think in some of these areas, it's more difficult to quantify. And again, I'd say IT has done a great job of trying to quantify what the potential impacts are of losing this key system versus maybe a legacy secondary system. And when you quantify the risk, you can think about, does the investment really justify making those changes in the business so that you're more resilient versus an area that we talked about earlier, like geopolitics. It's hard to figure out what the actual impact is until you have a scenario kind of right in front of you to figure out, okay, well, we have so much of our business in that country and the tariffs are X%. So what does that mean to our margins? It's a lot more straightforward, I think, in a lot of respects in the IT space. And that's only because people have spent a lot of time working on how to quantify those impacts.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just always amazed at the cyber because there's uncertainty always. There's new bad actors, as you suggest, and even the human element where we train colleagues to look for fakes, but it's hard. So I appreciate what you and IT and our CISO are doing to help keep us all safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
You talk about human factor. It's amazing every day the bad guys get better about what the fakes look like. So they're using AI to make their fakes look more professional and take out typos and things that were obvious tells of a ploy for phishing or whatever. And now, they look professional. You might think that I just saw one last night, Instagram users may see prompts to change their password, and a lot of people would just blindly go, I need to change my password, but it's actually the bad guys directing you to put your credentials into a site that they run so that they can get into your Instagram account. It's a quickly evolving space. So I don't relish what they have to fight against.
With that, let's move on to organization readiness and preparedness. Can you share an example of adapting to a rising exposure and volatility and what led to the success?
Well, I can give one concrete example. So when I was at International Paper, where I worked for about 20 years, we had a couple of different groups that had arisen due to specific scenarios. So we had a pandemic planning committee that had arisen out of SARS and MERS and Ebola and things that had happened on a regional basis prior. And then we also had a business continuity function that really started out with being based here in Memphis, having IT assets sitting in an earthquake zone, and the IT people being concerned about how do we think about disaster recovery and business continuity if there were to be a big earthquake in Memphis. And fast forward years later, that evolved through supply chain issues and how do we think about operational impacts. And if you go to January of 2020, we called our business continuity team together because we were seeing a lot of port delays in China, in Shanghai, and other areas. The deliveries of raw materials weren't coming out as expected. And at first, we thought we should get together and just talk through how do we flex the supply chain to other areas until this works through the system. And we all know what happened. This local flu or whatever became the COVID pandemic. And I think having all those people together prior, working through tabletop exercises and different scenarios, we all knew who to talk to if something happened in our particular areas. They knew to come to us for certain things and vice versa. So we had the connectivity already. We had the comfort level of how the organization worked. And we had worked through scenarios where you had to build that muscle memory. And so I feel like it was a real positive experience working through COVID with that group because we all had been kind of in the proverbial trenches before. And now that we had a real test in front of us, we were ready for it. So I don't think IP publicized that a whole lot, but I think we did a really good job with that because of the investment in preparation and resilience.
Yeah, that is a great example. And preparedness was key. companies, we saw it through the pandemic, companies that were prepared and those really that weren't, those that were able to shift to remote work or even, as you said, being able to continue your business, and the early insights around supply chain, really fascinating. I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
Let's look ahead, building a resilient organization. As we look to the future, what are the most important steps organizations can take to move from moderate to full preparedness?
Well, I would say that being fully prepared is a lofty goal, but it's a very difficult one to achieve in a lot of scenarios. But I would say that going back to a couple things we talked about earlier, one would be if you're not using scenario planning or you're not having occasional exercises around scenario planning, to really take that on. Again, it doesn't have to be owned by risk, but it can happen at the ops leadership level, kind of the strategy conversation level, but it should be happening. And I think risk professionals can help facilitate those conversations. And so I think that's one. Another one that we alluded to earlier is really working through improving collaboration and senior buy-in and sponsorship for things like business continuity, disaster recovery, crisis management, things that you can put in place that don't have to be specific to geopolitics or supply chain or cyber, but areas that help you just have a more resilient internal framework for dealing with adversity or things that don't go according to plan. Another one is probably around ongoing risk assessment and how you adapt to change. So as your operations evolve and change, whether it's new products, geographies, a new leadership and operations, you need to go through and update the assessment of risk in those situations, what your response plans look like, and adapt accordingly to those changes. So that is kind of a dynamic thing that doesn't go away. It just should be kind of part of the refresh of your preparations. And then lastly is really just around having that culture of resilience and agility. So it's encouraging planning and preparation, encouraging collaboration, and whether it's addressing business problems or new issues or concerns with clients, but having a cross-section of people that collaborate on addressing those issues so that they're comfortable working together and they're ready to respond if something bigger happens.
Yeah, I want to go back to that buy-in from stakeholders and maybe even that senior level. If somebody in risk feels like they don't have that seat, do you have a few suggestions or tips to offer?
That's a tough one. I mean, that's, I think, a burning question for a lot of us risk professionals. And I think the first thing is probably trying to just build relationships outside of whether it's insurance renewals or your typical conversations with leadership. Build connectivity with them so that they see that you're not the department of no. You and I have talked about that before. We want to make sure that risk leaders are being leaders, that we're not just being seen as obstructive to getting business done. I think it's important to talk outside of there being an urgent need or you're asking for spend for something, to have a conversation about how risk management can add value. And if you're not sure how you can add value, then you probably need to work with your external advisors and probably your internal leadership on ways that you can add value, and make sure that you're thinking about building that connectivity and that conversation around how you can add value, how you can contribute to the organization meeting its objectives, not just trying to fix things when it doesn't go according to plan.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think those are great suggestions for the audience. So any final thoughts?
Well, I would just say that, given what we talked about in the survey at the beginning, from my standpoint, uncertainty and volatility appear to be persistent issues for all business leaders to navigate, not just risk professionals. So how can risk professionals really look at how to help their firms build resilience, to handle the unexpected? And that will be the difference between a firm being a great firm and an industry leader versus the rest of the pack. So, for those of us that want to do the best we can and help our companies be as successful as possible, I think we have to help our companies figure out how to build that infrastructure and how to overcome those things that are really unknowns at this point, whatever they might be.
That's a fantastic close. Thank you, Dave. You've been a great guest today. I appreciate you joining, and I'm sure our audience were taking notes and learned a lot today. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Kimberly. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And to our audience, once again, thank you for listening in to the Sedgwick Podcast. Be sure and hit the like button, subscribe, so you never miss an episode. Be well.